Good morning. Welcome to today's Sunday morning forum here with St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Today we have part 3 in our 3-part series with Dr. Jennifer McClure, who is an assistant professor of religion, a sociologist of religion at Samford University here in the Birmingham area. And today, Dr. McClure is going to be presenting about Jesus' social network and the 4 Gospels, exploring similarities and differences across the Gospels. And so we're pleased to be able to welcome you back with us again this Sunday morning.
Thank you. So today is the 3rd and final presentation from this project. And what I'd like to do in our last time together is to look at the 4 Gospels and to think about how they are similar and different in how they present Jesus' social network. And this matters because there are key differences among the different Gospels. And a key term that scholars of the Gospels use to describe 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is synoptic. And this basically means that they see together, or they have fairly similar stories and narratives and content. And so among the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have a significant amount of overlap in the content and in the stories. Now, this is not to say that there are not unique things about each gospel. Among Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are still key differences in how the authors frame the gospel, but John, compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is much more distinctive. John includes stories like Jesus healing a man who was born blind, or Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, that are not included in the Synoptic Gospels. But then John doesn't include things that are common in the Synoptic Gospels, like the transfiguration of Christ, or narratives about Christ's birth, or even narratives about Jesus healing people who are demon possessed. And so John is more distinctive, and so part of this is I'm curious to see if the social network in John is also distinctive from Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's. So I'm looking at if the social networks depicted in the Gospels and if the relational dynamics in those Gospels differ. And there has been a lot of research among biblical scholars about differences in the way Jesus' life and ministry are depicted across the Gospels, about differences in Jesus' teachings, about differences in even language and wording and theological emphasis across the Gospels. And what I'm curious about is if social network analysis can identify new insights that previous biblical scholarship hasn't looked at. So today I'm going to look at 3 questions. The first concerns how much the Gospel's social networks overlap. The second one has to do with centrality or relational prominence, and if the Gospels differ in who they present as more relationally prominent. And then third, I'll be looking at if the Gospels differ in their relational structures. And so to start, here is an image. Here are images of the 4 Gospels. As you're looking at it, you might notice that Matthew's and Mark's look relatively similar in their structure. Luke's looks a little bit different, and John's looks significantly different. And this sort of foreshadows some of what we're going to find. So first, I'd like to look at just trying to measure levels of overlap. And I'm going to use something called QAP correlations, it's quadratic assignment procedure. You don't need to worry about the details. But what I do need you to know is that the closer the number is to 1, the more closely the networks match. And if the correlation was 1, then the networks would be identical. The closer the number is to 0, the more likely that a relationship in one network has no bearing on whether that relationship exists in the other network. And so the higher the number is, the more overlap there is between the networks in that pair of Gospels. And so when we look at the numbers here, if we look at the correlations for Matthew and Mark and Luke, they are fairly high, above 0.6. Between Matthew and Mark, it's the highest, very, very strong overlap between Matthew and Mark. But if you compare the 3 synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke to John, you will see that the correlation or the measure of overlap is a lot lower. And so this does reflect how there is more similarity, not just in Jesus's teaching or in the narratives that are presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but there's also a lot more similarity in how Jesus's relational structure is described in the Synoptic Gospels, where John, there are significant differences when it comes to John. There's another way that we can look at overlap, and it has to do with prominence in the network. And if you were with us for the first of the talk, I talked about something called degree centrality. And degree centrality, as a reminder, is just how many relationships someone has, with the thought that people who have more relationships are more interconnected and more relationally prominent in the network. Now, interestingly here, what I did was I had to normalize the degree centrality so that we could compare it, because when we have networks of different sizes, and I'll give, for example, Matthew's network is larger than John's. So if someone has 10 relationships in Matthew and 10 relationships in John, really that's not equal because the networks differ in size. And so the numbers that I have here are what percentage of the network people within the average person within a group reaches through their friendships. So the average member of Jesus's family and followers in Matthew reaches 19% of the network through their relationships, where in Matthew, the average stigmatized person reaches 3% of the network through their relationships. If you were with us for the first talk, I talked about how Jesus's family and followers were more interconnected in the network than the civil and religious authorities, and that stigmatized people of those 3 categories were the least likely to be interconnected or to have more relational ties in the network. So you'll see this in this chart, but I'm going to look at these 3 groups as well as women in the network. And I'd like to point out some ways in which specific gospels are fairly similar or stand out. And I think the first thing I'd like to mention for Matthew and Mark is that there's a lot of similarity. We don't really see any numbers that are standing out a significant amount. When we look at Luke, there's really one way that Luke stands out from Matthew and Mark. And part of the similarity does have to do with all 3 being synoptic or being fairly similar in the basic content that they present. But in Luke, the average person in the group of Jesus' family and followers reaches a much smaller part of the network. In Luke, the average person reaches an average of about 6% of the network. In Matthew and Mark, the average person among Jesus' family and followers reaches about 20% of the network. So it's a fairly significant difference. And what I noticed with this in Luke is that Luke does not present Jesus' disciples as less central. So it's not like Simon Peter or James and John, sons of Zebedee, are significantly less central in Luke than in Matthew and Mark. In Matthew and Mark, sort of the disciples have, the key 12 disciples have fairly similar centrality in Luke as in Matthew and Mark. But where we see the difference is that Luke includes a lot more family and followers who are not mentioned in Matthew and Mark. One of the ways that scholars have noticed that Luke differs is that Luke has a stronger emphasis and includes more female actors. And so Luke is more clearly going to give the names and identities of different women who follow Jesus, not just Mary Magdalene, who's mentioned in Matthew and Mark, but women like Susanna or Joanna, who are not mentioned in the other Gospels. And so these women are less connected in the network than the 12 disciples are. Similarly, in Luke, in terms of Jesus's infancy narratives, Luke includes unique people like the shepherds, or like Simeon and Anna, who acknowledge Christ's identity even as an infant in the temple. And so that's another example of family and followers that are unique to Luke, that because there are more family and followers that are unique to Luke, and the family and followers that are unique to Luke are less central or have fewer relationships than the disciples who are mentioned in all the Gospels. That decreases the centrality of the family and followers within Luke's network. Now, John's network, which we've already seen is different. John's network is fairly different in how it depicts group centrality. And there are 3 groups that are significantly more central in John than in the Synoptic Gospels. And they are the civil and religious authorities, stigmatized people, and women. And when we look at the civil and religious authorities, some of this distinctive result in John has to do with John presenting a particular religious authority differently than the Synoptic Gospels. And so John has this group that is really not referred to in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but is fairly frequently referred to in John, called the Jews. And many biblical scholars will argue that this group is not referring to your average Jewish person. It's referring to the Jewish religious leaders. But John is less likely to differentiate those religious leaders into Pharisees or Sadducees or scribes or lawyers, or teachers of the law. And so because John does not differentiate as clearly between the religious leaders and opts just to refer to them as the Jews, that group of religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, is very, very, very central in John's network, because John is not differentiating between the different religious leaders. And because of that, the levels of centrality for the authorities in John are significantly higher, because this group called the Jews or the Jewish leaders is tied into so many of the narratives. John also depicts stigmatized people as having interactions with a wider wider percentage of the network. And if you remember, if you were with us for the second talk, we talked about a group of stigmatized people who were very isolated, who were very marginalized, who had connections with Jesus, but if they had any other connection, it was typically a negative relationship with an authority figure. And one of the things that I noticed across the Gospels is that these negative connections between authority figures and stigmatized people were much, much, much more common in John than in the Synoptic Gospels. And these extra connections with the authority figures help to make stigmatized people more central in John. And what I think is happening here, and I'll actually show you some pictures of this later, is that in narratives in John where Jesus is interacting with stigmatized people, um, typically healing them or talking with them, Jesus experiences more opposition from the religious leaders in the narratives in John than in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is some antagonism in Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the religious leaders toward Jesus's interactions with stigmatized people, but it's a lot more common for this to be happening in John. And so that helps the stigmatized people to be more relationally connected within the network. Lastly, when we look at women, compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, compared to the Synoptic Gospels, John depicts the women as more relationally prominent. And a good example of this in John is Mary, Jesus's mother. In the Synoptic Gospels, she is in the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew and Luke that have infancy narratives for Jesus. She's depicted as part of those narratives, as having connections with Joseph, as having connections with Jesus's brothers, but she does not play a major role in the narrative. There is a bit of debate. There's a Mary, in addition to Mary Magdalene, who's present at Jesus's burial and around some of the resurrectional narratives. There are debates about whether that Mary is Jesus's mom or a different Mary, but I coded her as a different Mary in this study. So with that decision, Mary, Jesus's mom, is not very strongly tied into the narratives in Matthew, Mark, and Luke beyond connections with other family members of Jesus. But in John, she's more strongly connected to Jesus's disciples because they go to a wedding in Cana together. In John, she is explicitly present at the crucifixion, where Jesus asks the beloved disciple, who some people think is John's son of Zebedee, but there are scholarly debates about that. But at the crucifixion, she's there, and Jesus asked the beloved disciple to take care of his mom. And there are some other situations as well where she is a larger part of the picture. And so that's an example about how John ties women more prominently into the relational structure. I'd like to turn to our third question now about how the relational structure is similar to and different between the Gospels. And I will start with Matthew and Mark because this is where we saw the most overlap. And in their networks, what I did was I split them up into clusters so that relational ties were maximized within clusters and minimized between clusters. If you were with us the second talk, this was the analysis that grouped Jesus with a lot of stigmatized people, where if Jesus was taken out of the network, a lot of the stigmatized people wouldn't have connections to the broader network. And so this is that same approach to identifying clusters. And when we look at Matthew and Mark, they have the same 5 clusters. They may not always have the same people in all the clusters, but the broad structure is the same. And the first cluster, where you see the little icon of Jesus, includes Jesus, stigmatized people who otherwise didn't have other connections within the network. Some of the religious leaders, including the Pharisees and including Herod Antipas, are in the first subgroup. And then also people who are involved in the crucifixion. So the soldiers, the other criminals, the 2 criminals with whom Jesus was crucified, they are all in the same subgroup. In the second subgroup, so moving counterclockwise to the left, the big green dot is the disciples of Jesus when they're mentioned as a group and not differentiated into individual disciples. And then other people who interacted with that whole group of disciples. The third subgroup at the bottom is the individual disciples of Jesus, except for Judas Iscariot, and the people who interacted specifically with individual disciples. In the fourth subgroup, again moving counterclockwise, where you see a number of the fuchsia circles, and I'll remind you, green circles are family and followers, fuchsia circles are civil and religious authorities, and yellow circles are stigmatized people, and green circles are others. In our fourth subgroup, we see mainly people who participated either in Jesus's betrayal or trial. And so the green dot that we see in the fourth subgroup is Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. But we also have the different religious leaders who betrayed Jesus to Pontius Pilate and who accused him during the trial. We also have Pontius Pilate in this fourth subgroup as well. And then lastly, our fifth subgroup to above and to the right of Jesus's subgroup are Jesus's family and followers. And in Matthew, which has an infancy narrative, which Mark lacks, other people who are part of the infancy narrative, like the wise men, are also part of that fifth subgroup in Matthew. So largely, these 2 gospels have a lot of overlap. They depict people very similarly in terms of centrality, and they have essentially the same relational structure. But when we look at Luke, there's some similarities, but there are also some differences. And there are 3 key similarities. And the one is that the first subgroup, counterclockwise from Jesus's subgroup, is based on the disciples of Jesus when mentioned as a group and people who interacted specifically with that group. The next subgroup, counterclockwise, is the different individual disciples of Jesus. Again, I think except, actually, I think Judas is actually in that subgroup with the rest of the disciples. So that is a difference. And then the subgroup to the right of Jesus is his family members, so Mary, Joseph, brothers, and then people from his infancy, like the shepherds, or Simeon, or Anna. Now, we see some key differences, and the first has to do with the subgroup that Jesus is in. If you look at this subgroup in Luke, there are a lot more civil and religious authorities. In Jesus's subgroup, than in Matthew and Mark. And I'm going to go back to Matthew and Mark real quick just so that you can see. In Matthew and Mark, there are some civil and religious authorities, again, some fuchsia circles in Jesus's subgroup, but most of them are in the fourth subgroup. But that is different in Luke, where almost all of the civil and religious authorities are in Jesus's subgroup. And so Jesus' subgroup does include people, in Luke, does include people connected to the crucifixion. It does include many stigmatized people, but it draws in the people from the betrayal and arrest and trial into Jesus's subgroup. And some of why that happens has to do with Herod Antipas. And so this is not Herod the Great who tried to kill Jesus as a baby. This is his son. But this is the Herod that was part of Jesus's trial before his crucifixion. And Herod is only depicted as being part of the trial in Luke. Herod does not play a role in the trial in Matthew or Mark. In Matthew and Mark, Herod plays a role in terms of John the Baptist's beheading. But in Luke, Herod plays a role in the trial, and because of that, Herod creates more interconnections between the people who were originally in Matthew and Mark's subgroup that Jesus was in, and then the subgroup that's separate in Matthew and Mark related to the arrest and betrayal and trial. And so because of Herod's role in Jesus's trial in Luke, that brings almost all the civil and religious authorities into the main subgroup that Jesus is part of. Another key difference in Luke's network is that Luke's network includes a significantly higher number of stigmatized people and women than Matthew's or Mark's. And this reflects insights of other biblical scholars about how Luke has a stronger emphasis on people who are excluded and on women. And so we see both of these groups showing up more in Luke. And the subgroup in Luke that is in the place of the fourth subgroup, so this group that is all yellow dots, 10 yellow dots, is the 10 lepers whom Jesus healed. And the narrative about Jesus healing these lepers is unique to Luke. And because those lepers are a tightly interconnected group, they form really their own cluster in the network, and go to show that just Luke has a stronger emphasis and includes more stigmatized people. So I'd like to move to John's network, and I just need you to know that it is very different. And I'll go back. This is what Matthew and Mark's look like. This is what Luke's looks like, which has some differences, but some similarities in structure. And then John's is just different. And in John's, there are 4, not 5 clusters. And there's really only one similarity. And it is that in Jesus's network, he is connected, he's grouped with people who are stigmatized, and he's also grouped with people who are connected to his crucifixion, whether soldiers or the 2 criminals with whom he was crucified. Everything else is pretty much different. And the first difference that we see in the first cluster, counterclockwise to Jesus's, is that Jesus's family and followers are largely grouped in the same cluster. Unlike the Synoptic Gospels, where we see disciples and family members being in different clusters. And some of this has to do with Mary, Jesus's mother, and Jesus's disciples all being present at the wedding in Cana where he turned water into wine. Some of it involves Jesus's mother Mary and the beloved disciple being together at Jesus's crucifixion. And there are other situations in which there are relationships depicted between Jesus's family members and his disciples that are not mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. And so because of that, the family and followers are largely in the same cluster. One of the big differences between John and the other three Gospels has to do with where stigmatized people are clustered. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, most of the stigmatized people are in Jesus's cluster, or in Luke, in the cluster of 10 lepers. But in John, there are a significant number of stigmatized people who are in a cluster that's dominated by religious authorities. And this ties into what I mentioned earlier about in John, when Jesus heals someone or interacts with someone who's stigmatized, the narratives are more likely to connect that with antagonism from religious authorities. And some of this happens in what scholars call John's signs narratives. So scholars have identified 7 narratives in which Jesus performs different miracles, like turning water into wine, or healing a paralytic, or healing a man who was born blind, or raising Lazarus from the dead. Those are 4 of those narratives. And in the signs narratives, there's more likely to be antagonism from authorities toward Jesus and the people whom he healed or raised from the dead. And so for the man who was born blind, the authorities kick him out of the synagogue for saying that, Jesus has the authority to be able to do that. After Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, the authorities wanted to kill Lazarus because everyone or more people were starting to believe in Jesus. And so there's more antagonism depicted in John. And that's why we get some more stigmatized people being grouped with the authorities and not with Jesus. The last thing, and this is our final subgroup to the right of Jesus' subgroup. And in John, there are some situations where Andrew and Philip are mediators between other people and Jesus. 2 examples are when some Greeks come and want to see Jesus, they come to Andrew and Philip first, and then they go to Jesus. Another example is where Jesus heals thousands of people with a little boy's lunch. And with that, the little boy interacts with Andrew and Philip, who then connect him with Jesus. And so Andrew and Philip have this unique role in creating a bridge toward Jesus in a few narratives in John, and so that puts them in this unique cluster. So, to recap, one of the interesting things about using social network analysis to understand the Gospels is that it brings different tools than the main textual tools that biblical scholars typically use. And social network analysis does identify some results that biblical scholars have already identified. And this is a good thing because it means that social network analysis is accurately gauging some things. And so it gauges the overlap between Matthew, Mark, and Luke among the Synoptic Gospels, and then shows difference in John. Social network analysis emphasizes stigmatized people and women in Luke, and that reflects previous insights. Scholars have previously talked about a greater emphasis on women and the Jewish leaders in John, which this supports. And scholars have also talked about how stigma and authority are combined in Jesus's signs narratives in John, that typically when Jesus is interacting with someone who's stigmatized in John, there does tend to be some opposition from the authorities. But this study also creates new insights that biblical scholars, I hope, can look at more. And the first thing has to do with Herod's role in Luke. Herod's role in Jesus' trial in Luke creates a closer relationship between Herod and the other civil and religious authorities. And if you're familiar with that narrative, Luke is where the author makes the point that Herod and Pontius Pilate's friendship was strengthened because of both of their role in Jesus's trial. And so I think trying to understand Herod's role in Luke's trial narrative is something that people can look at and reflect on more. And then another thing that I found interesting was the unique role of Andrew and Philip and John, where they at points act as bridges to help other people connect to Jesus. And I haven't really seen much conversation among scholars about why Andrew and Philip have this role. You could ask, why not Simon Peter? Why not James and John, sons of Zebedee, who are more prominently tied into some narratives in the Synoptic Gospels? Why Andrew and Philip? I hope more people will talk about those questions. And so I think we can switch back to some conversation, and then I can do some final conclusions from all three talks. I cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry.
You're fine. I do it all the time.
And at least once in every Zoom conversation that happens. This time it was me. With Andrew and Philip, it is interesting to consider what makes them different, like what makes them more likely to be those bridge figures to other people. Like, I don't know, do you have like further thoughts on that as far as like what we know about them and their backgrounds and their experiences prior to being disciples? Like, is there something about where they're from or their cultural group? Or
one of the ways in which they're emphasized in John, which I didn't mention, was that in John chapter 1, when Jesus, when John the Baptist says, Jesus is the Lamb of God, he sends some of his disciples to go follow Jesus. And I think Andrew is one of them. And then Andrew finds Philip and says, you know, we found the Messiah. And so I think one of the ways in which they build another connection between Jesus and someone else is between Jesus and John the Baptist. Now, they're not helping John the Baptist come and approach Jesus.
Right.
And the way that they helped Greeks or this boy who had the loaves and the fish, but they are still creating a bit of a bridge. But it's not necessarily clear to me how that bridge with John the Baptist would translate into a bridge with some of these other groups. So I'm not really sure how to think about that yet, and I'm hoping that maybe some biblical scholars who have more expertise on the Gospels can explore that some.
Well, I mean, I don't know, the beginning of my thought on that, although not being an expert per se, but
Sure.
based on my reading of the Bible and understanding of John the Baptist, I mean, his position is really pretty distinctive in that he
Sure.
is a relative of Jesus,
Hmm.
and he is this major
Sure.
prophetic figure who is the one immediate whose call is to proclaim the coming soon of the Messiah,
Sure.
and a baptizer, um, who then had followers of his own, but then he's directing them to, ultimately, it's not about following me, it's about following the one whom I'm proclaiming.
Hmm.
And then the fact that he is this figure out in the wilderness and, kind of has this just kind of, though he's depicted as being such a distinctive figure as far as how he talks with people and the
Hmm.
way he doesn't seem to conform to social norms, at
Sure.
least the way
Sure.
that's how it gets talked about popularly now.
Sure.
I wonder if, yeah, being connected to someone who himself was such a distinct character with that particular, very particular role of being both family member and
Sure.
proclaimer of the Messiah. Yeah, I think you're onto something with that connection between him and John the Baptist being part of what makes Andrew anyway more likely to be.
Sure. Sure. And one of the things that social network analysis doesn't pick up well, is that John the Baptist does get more emphasis in the Gospel of John in
Mhm.
terms of, but it's mainly in terms of the theological writings
Mm.
or in teachings of Jesus about John or John about Jesus. And that doesn't necessarily tie into the social network because, Jesus teaches about John and John teaches about Jesus. That means they have a relationship.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily result in a lot of other connections between John and other members of the network.
Mhm.
And so social network analysis really can't pick up some of the emphasis in teaching. But
Mhm.
I'm wondering if, because of the connection to John the Baptist, those two continue to get more emphasis throughout the gospel.
And you're saying, so is Philip also connected with John the Baptist? It was both Andrew and Philip?
Well, I think Andrew was a disciple of John, and then Andrew told Philip, "We've seen the Christ."
Okay, I see.
And so
So
Andrew
one
was a bit
agreed
of the
to,
bridge to Philip. Yeah,
right. But then together they
yeah,
connected others. Yeah,
yeah. They connected Greeks. They connected the little boy with fish and loaves.
right. Um, I'm trying to recall what um, what their cultural identity, their ethnicity was. Was it different than others of the disciples?
I don't. Let's see. Andrew, according to the Synoptic Gospels, is Simon Peter's brother, and
Right,
I think they were both Galileans.
right.
Philip, I'm not sure. I don't think there's much stated in scripture,
Hmm.
but they're not Matthew, who's a tax collector.
Right.
They're not one of the Simons who's pointed, or they're not. I think there's a Simon the Zealot among the disciples, and so they're not pointed out like as a violent zealot or as a sinful tax collector. So, I mean, in the Synoptic Gospels, they're mentioned among the disciples, and then they really don't get much emphasis at all.
Hmm.
But they get this interesting emphasis in John.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's definitely worth hopefully some biblical scholars digging in deeper, or other people who that's their
Sure,
area. So
sure.
the other thing I wanted to ask you about, as far as, let's see, this idea of the authorities and their connection to stigmatized people, in terms of um, why did people in positions of authority oppose Jesus having connections with stigmatized people so much, do you think? Like how did it harm them, or like what was the problem? I think it depends on the situation, on the particular stigmatized person, but
Sure.
why do you think that seemed like to be threatening to them?
So one of the arguments that biblical scholars will make about John's signs narratives is that they are there, they're not just miracles, they are signs to Jesus's identity.
Mhm.
And John, of all the Gospels, is incredibly explicit that Jesus is God's son and Jesus is God. And John is more explicit. The other Gospels are saying that, but John says it again and again and again and again and again. The Word was with God, the Word was God, I and the Father are one, the Word became flesh. It's much more strongly emphasized. And so these miracles are presented as signs because they point to Jesus's identity as the Son of God and as God. And so I think part of why we see more antagonism from the authorities is that John often depicts them as in antagonism toward Jesus's identity. And so when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, they want to kill him because they think he's committing blasphemy. How could they didn't understand how someone could say that? Or before Abraham was born, I am, which is the divine name, which is God's name. They thought he was breaking all the laws and, mad and crazy or demon possessed or something. And so we see their opposition or antagonism toward Jesus's identity throughout those parts of the narrative. And I think that because the signs narratives are depicting not just Jesus's miraculous abilities, but his interactions with the stigmatized as being essential to his identity and who God really is, that opposition from the authorities gets tied up not just toward his identity, but also toward stigmatized people.
Makes sense. Yeah. So, on one level, it makes sense that depending on the gospel, Jesus' social network is going to come across differently because they have their different emphases on different stories, depending on which gospel we're looking at. And that particular combination of stories in each gospel, will present Jesus and the way he connected with people slightly or potentially dramatically differently with
Sure.
John. So, but I think, that's definitely a standard observation people have as far as John being very different than the other gospels, thus, them being lumped in as synoptics and John. I think it's a valuable part of our canon that we have these different versions, that there's not just one version of Jesus's life story. There's not just one version of here's the story of Jesus and how he connected with other people. It's you get it through these 4 different lenses, and I think that reading them together allows us to kind of get those different nuances in how Jesus connected with people, that together we kind of get a full picture of Jesus and his time of public ministry and the time before too.
And in God's wisdom, he decided to let humans tell his story. Right? God could have sent us a perfect book down from heaven that included all the details. It could have been multiple volumes, just about a year of Jesus's life.
Mhm.
And he decided not to do that. He let humans tell his story. And so, because of that, we get to see these different elements of Jesus's life and ministry and identity and different emphases in his teaching because of the ways that the gospel writers are framing his life and ministry to different communities.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I like that way of putting it. God and his wisdom invited people to be involved, yeah, in the
Yeah.
telling of the story. Yeah, and you're right. He could have just sent down one
Sure.
very comprehensive volume, but there's so much to be gained. The
Mhm.
richness of looking at them all together, and then alongside all of the other books in the
Sure.
canon too.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this segment has fewer faith applications than some of the others, but I think one of the big takeaways for me has to do with, God letting people tell his story.
Mhm.
And we see differences, not just in the way the network is depictive, but some differences in teachings and some differences in how different situations are depicted.
Mhm.
Just because we get a fuller understanding of Jesus' life and ministry with these 4 different perspectives.
I agree.
So, if you want, I can do maybe one more slide to just do some final summaries of the 3 sessions. Okay. So, a couple final summaries is that, again, Jesus is relational. The sole reason why we can study Jesus' social network is because he is human and he's relational. And as part of the Trinity, God is community, and God is a community of 3 persons. And so God is inherently relational. And then Jesus is relational also because he's fully human and fully divine. And so, because of that, it's important not just to understand his life and ministry and his teachings, but also to understand the relationships surrounding him. Social network analysis does give us a unique window into understanding sort of social dynamics surrounding Jesus' life and ministry that sometimes we don't get with the textual tools from biblical studies. And hopefully you've enjoyed this and found this to be a creative approach for understanding the Gospels. Down the road, I would love to write a book on this. It might be a while, but I'd like to write a book that's not geared towards scholars, but that's geared toward, your average person who's not a college professor, and that can introduce some of these ideas without getting bogged down in some of the technical details, and that can focus on the theological implications of Jesus' social network and then practical applications for how we ought to live based on how Jesus interacted with people in his network. And a lot of the more practical implications that we've talked about today and the previous 2 sessions will be key parts of this book that I look forward to writing at some point, hopefully in the next 5 years.
All right. Well, we look forward to hopefully getting to see that book come out in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So,
And thank you for the opportunity to come and give these talks. It's been a lot of fun.
yeah, it's a place to test out these ideas to that,
Sure.
wider audience, out in the church
Yeah.
and beyond academia. So, yeah, we're glad that you could be with us these past 3 weeks, and we're kind of excited to have this as the kind of the foundation on which we're building on for the next couple of weeks, kind of continuing to look at reimagining mission with all of that we've learned from you the last 3 weeks on Jesus' social network in mind.
Sure.
Next week, we have a scholar of digital religion from Texas A&M, Heidi Campbell, who will be talking about how to be the church online and offline and digital culture. So she's a communication studies scholar who kind of one of the founders of the study of digital religion. And so she's going to share some of her research and kind of practical applications for us in the church, especially this year, having done more online version of church than what we've been used to. And then the couple of weeks following her, we're going to be looking at some case studies from the Church of England that we are connected to in the Anglican Communion, where we'll have someone from the Diocese of London talking about work that he's done there, and then a seminary professor at one of our Episcopal seminaries who's taken groups over to London to kind of see some of the innovative things they've been doing as far as reimagining mission and reimagining the way parishes and their people connect with their communities. I actually participated in that, one of his travel courses. And so I think kind of giving people some examples from outside our local context, kind of that there's something to be learned from that then we apply back here. But I think it's all interconnected in terms of how did Jesus connect with people? What do we learn from that we now can apply and then learn the next few weeks, like now looking at our contemporary cultural context, how do we think about our own social networks and what we believe about Jesus and the way he related to people. So that's how I see it fitting all together. I'm glad you could get us started in this way.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. Again, if people have follow-up questions that you'd like me to pass along to Dr. McClure, I'm happy to email those along to her as well. So that's where we'll end it for today. And I invite all of you to join us again next Sunday at 9 for Heidi Campbell's presentation on being church in a digital culture. And we'll see you all then.